You know, I was gonna open this video the same way I do with all of them, with like a resigned sigh, and then I'd go, alright, let's get into this, or something to that effect to express my dismay. But the thing is, I just don't have that in me this time, you know? Like, there's really only so many times I can make the exact same video criticizing the exact same creative teams for making the exact same mistakes for the exact same reasons. And that's exactly what I'd be doing here, because Maul Shadow Lord is not different from any of the other shows I've reviewed in any meaningful way. It looks nicer, I guess. I mean, I'm not really into the art style, and frankly, I'm tired of them always reheating the nachos of a TV show that came out almost 20 years ago, but it's easier on the eyes than the washed out, colorless, volume overloaded garbage that is the live action stuff, so I guess we can call that a win. But fundamentally, as nice as it may look, this show does the exact same things and falls into the exact same pitfalls as every one of these Disney Plus Star Wars shows, and I just don't know how much more I can add to the conversation without it feeling repetitive. I could, if I wanted to, make a bog standard run-of-the-mill video about why this show is bad and rake in all the cash from the amount of views that would probably get me, but I just don't think that would be fulfilling. So instead, I'd like to do this a little differently. I'm still going to talk about the Maul show and go over all my many criticisms of it, but before I do that, I'd like to ask you a question, and I'd like for you guys to keep that question swilling in the back of your minds as you listen to what I have to say. What do you want from Star Wars? It's a fairly simple question, but again, I want you to really think about your answer. For yours truly, it's pretty straightforward and something I've repeated many times on this channel already. I want stories that are well written. I want thematically rich, character-driven narratives with coherent plots, and obviously I wouldn't say no to it being well shot and directed, but frankly, that's a secondary concern for me. I don't think I'm necessarily breaking any new ground by saying any of this, because I think it's what most people will claim they want, and those that don't, those who really only care about the mindless spectacle and are getting exactly what they want out of shows like Maul aren't gonna watch this video anyway. But it's worth getting into it because many of the people who claim to care about upholding standards, about criticizing shows when they execute their ideas poorly, will often turn around and act like you just stepped on their dog's tail when you apply the exact same standards towards a show they happen to like. In the case of Maul Shadow Lord, it really isn't that hard to understand how we've arrived at this point. I rewatched all the animated material with Maul from the Clone Wars and Rebels before starting on this video, and as you'll know from past videos of mine, I don't exactly rate those shows very highly. I think the Clone Wars in particular is really rough when it comes to the writing, and the Maul episodes are hardly an exception. They're rushed, contrived, and stupid in a lot of ways, built upon a premise that I find fundamentally unworkable, because reviving Maul at all was a massive narrative error that obliterates the stakes and world building. Even if I think there's a lot of great character work done for him in these shows, I've been on record in the past saying that I don't think the storylines themselves are very good, but the broken writing has never stopped people from loving these episodes in the past. In many ways, Darth Maul is hype moments and aura personified into a single character. He barely does anything in The Phantom Menace, and to say he's a particularly fleshed out character in that film would be dishonest, frankly, but he's got a pretty badass look, one of the coolest lightsaber fights in the whole saga, and said fight is accompanied by one of the best John Williams scores ever made. And like I already said, the Clone Wars arcs concerning him have some of the most broken writing mechanics I've ever seen in this franchise, which is saying a lot, frankly. So Maul has been surrounded by bad writing for his entire tenure, with very little exception, but he's so goddamn cool that people have never really cared, so why should I expect any different now? To get into the specifics, Maul Shadow Lord is set some nebulous amount of time after Revenge of the Sith, but probably no more than about a year from what I understand, which means we're still early days into the reign of the Empire, and the events of Episode 3 are still pretty fresh, as well as the Siege of Mandalore, which, chronologically speaking, is the last appearance we've had for Maul. And for those who need a reminder, as of that particular arc, Maul had previously amassed a sizable following of various powerful syndicates that formed what he called the Shadow Collective. And while there were some hiccups involved in the continued stability of that enterprise thanks to his capture by Sidious, and a subsequent tie-in comic depicting his escape from that jam and showing certain factions pull out of the collective, like the Hutts, we're generally shown that the Shadow Collective is still around, and Maul is the figurehead of several very powerful cartels. But apparently, as we learn pretty quickly here, all of that fell apart following the events on Mandalore, and it's not really clear why. We're given to understand that a lot of the syndicates disbanded from the collective shortly after Maul was captured by Republic forces, but I kinda don't believe it was because they'd suddenly lost faith in him or his ability to escape, because as I already said, Maul already faced a similar predicament, and they stayed loyal to him then, and this time he was only in captivity for like a day or two at most. The The show never really provides an explanation for why the syndicates betrayed Maul, and we just have to accept it for the sake of the premise. At this point, Maul is the leader of a small cadre of Night Brothers and a band of Mandalorians who've remained loyal to him, even despite him literally betraying their people.
Our forces are falling, we need your support!
No, I think not. Die well, Mandalorian.
No, quick!
Like, if anyone should have reason to abandon Maul's service, you'd think it'd be them, but whatever. They're hanging out on a planet called Janix, where two of the lower-level syndicate leaders that used to work for Maul are operating, because Maul's out for revenge, you see. He hates all the crime lords who betrayed him and wants to kill them all. I mean, that's Maul's character, right? That's what you came for, after all, isn't it? For yet another Darth Maul revenge quest? Because why should we do anything new or interesting with this character? And if it's gonna be about revenge, as it must always be, why can't that be directed towards some of the many people we already know Maul has it out for, like Kenobi or Sidious? Before we get into the specifics of how the story plays out, this is where I want to take a step back and explore what exactly is going on here. It might seem like I'm bitching about nothing right now, but I've been laying the groundwork for the larger meta exploration of what the show even is. You want to create a show about Darth Maul, which I really don't think is necessary, because even putting aside the fact that he should never have been brought back in the first place, the subsequent shows that have since depicted his journey have given us a pretty detailed accounting of his story. There really isn't that much more to tell here. He was a Sith apprentice for the first chunk of his life, then he got cut in half, spent over a decade in solitude, slowly toiling away in insanity, before getting found by his brother, starting the Shadow Collective, etc. Eventually we see in Solo that he's still a figurehead of a powerful crime organization, and when we find him in Rebels, we see that he's since lost that organization and is kinda just a reclusive old man doing anything he can to return himself to a position of power. This ultimately ends with his death at the hands of Obi-Wan after eventually tracking him to Tatooine and threatening the safety and anonymity of Luke. That's Maul's entire story, and the only real gap where we don't know specifically what happened is how did he lose his status as a crime lord and end up a hermit stranded on Malachor, which I don't really think is that interesting of a premise to turn into a whole show, but if you're looking to set it anywhere, that gap is probably your best bet. This particular era of Maul's story, following him in the early days of the Empire, isn't really that interesting because, as I said, we already know everything we need to know about that gap. We know that he's the leader of a bunch of powerful syndicates, and that seems to still be the case 10 years on when we catch up with him in Solo. So it seems like in order to make it so that there's a story worth telling here, the writers felt they needed to contrive events such that Maul is once again no longer in a position of power. Disney kinda has an obsession with scrappy underdog protagonists, Rebels versus Empire, Lone Jedi versus an army of Inquisitors, and Darth Vader, that sort of thing. So you won't usually find their main characters in prominent positions of power for very long. That's one of the main reasons why they rehashed that general premise in the sequel trilogy, despite it not making any sense. But in this case, I don't really see why that was necessary, because even if that's the only type of protagonist you guys know how to write, Maul being a powerful criminal entity does not mean he can't still be punching up, power-wise. This is the Imperial era, and Maul is kinda sorta wanted by the most powerful men in that empire, more than most Jedi survivors. So Maul would still need to keep his head down and operate from the shadows, relying on his henchmen to carry out his orders. And if you want this to be a show about Maul trying to get his revenge, maybe even make it so that he's amassing all this power so that he can have a force strong enough to really hurt the Empire, really piss in Palpatine's Cheerios, or at least make it that much harder for the Emperor's enforcers to track him down and kill him, use his own private army as a shield against the Sith. This is all a very long-winded way of saying I find the very premise this show is trying to build completely unnecessary, not to even mention all the ways in which it's contrived. But it's not all bad, right? I mean, the show at least keeps to the general idea that Maul wants to remain hidden while he rebuilds his empire. I mean, it's called Maul Shadow Lord, and he's pretty insistent that he wants to operate from the shadows.
Should I ready a team, we can eliminate him with ease.
I prefer to keep my presence a shadow. For now.
So the show very smartly recognizes that Maul is a careful, calculating figure who never does anything without a reason and has the strategic intellect to almost rival even Sidious. This is all very good stuff, and I'm glad the show... Wait, what is he doing? Is that his lightsaber? Wait, what are you doing? Maul, no! So the very first thing Maul does on the whole show is sabotage one of the local gangsters' operations so that he can start a war between him and the other mob boss. And instead of relying on his subordinates to carry out his orders, he decides to personally get involved in the operation with his fucking lightsaber and start cutting motherfuckers up. He does this multiple times just in the first couple of episodes, and he doesn't even bother to properly conceal his face or make sure there's no recoverable cam footage of the incident, so the police find exactly that within just a few hours of the whole debacle. Maul, buddy, what are we doing? The main cop character in the show is a guy named Captain Lawson, who doesn't really like the Empire and is at odds with his wife because she's a pretty high-ranking member of said Empire. So when he finds this footage of Maul and runs his face through the Imperial database, it immediately gets flagged as highly classified and high priority by the ISB. Lawson decides he'd rather not have the Empire taking control of his planet and getting involved in local police business, so he chooses to go against proper protocol by not reporting this to the Empire, much to the chagrin of his droid partner Two Boots, who I fucking hate for a number of reasons that we simply do not have time for. There are many problems with this, however. First and foremost, if Maul is as high priority as we're saying he is, and as he should be, then the second his face gets run through the database and flagged as important, someone at the ISB should have been alerted to this, and the Empire should already know that Maul is here on Janix, regardless of whether or not Lawson decided to call them in. But even pretending that's not how this works, Maul obviously couldn't have known Lawson was going to make the decision to break protocol and sweep this under the rug, because he quite literally doesn't know Lawson and only started to take an interest in the guy after this point. So Maul had no reason to rely on there being a cop with an interest in covering for him, meaning he was just being careless and stupid, which obviously isn't a great start. I'd like to remind you guys that while Maul might be overly ambitious at times, he was always careful with what moves he made and when. It's true that he went after Mandalore because of the personal connection it had to Obi-Wan, but he also recognized the potential of expanding his organization on a neutral planet where neither the Republic nor the Separatists could get directly involved in his affairs. He operated from behind the scenes, installing Almec as a puppet leader while he pulled the strings, and this forced Obi-Wan to come to him without Republic backing. But more crucially, he believed that this would be shield enough to keep Sidious from interfering until he had a more stable enterprise. A calculation that proved to be a grave mistake when Sidious showed up and kicked the ever-loving shit out of him and Savage. Do you guys remember how absolutely petrified Maul was when he sensed Palpatine's presence?
I sense a presence I haven't felt since Master.
How the second Sidious entered the room, Maul fell to his knees and desperately tried to pretend he'd built all this for him because he knew the reckoning that was about to happen. Do you remember this scene?
Have mercy. Please.
And all of this happened when Palpatine was still Chancellor, when his overall scope was severely limited compared to what it is now, with Palpatine on the throne of his very own galactic empire. Maul knows how dangerous he is, and actively dreads him, as we see at multiple points throughout the Clone Wars.
Darth Sidious. He is behind everything. In the shadows, always, but soon, very soon, he will reveal himself.
Let me go. Let me die.
We're all going to burn! We're all going to die! You don't know what you're doing!
So I just don't believe Maul would be so reckless as to casually wield his lightsaber out in the open and allow himself to get caught on camera. I don't believe he would even get involved in operations unless it was absolutely necessary, which I just don't think it was here. And this is only the first scene. Now, like I said, this opening scene shows Maul and his crew sabotaging the operations of Demas, one of the crime bosses Maul wants to kill for betraying him. They make off with a bunch of his credits and his bank droid who was overseeing this whole operation, and this all factors into his big plan to turn Demas against his rival Vario. But the way this all plays out is weird. Demas naturally suspects that it was Vario who was behind the sabotage, so he sets a meeting with him on neutral territory to get to the bottom of things, and Maul is able to spy on the proceedings from nearby. Interestingly, it doesn't take either of them very long to acknowledge the possibility that it was Maul's handiwork.
None of them had the nerve to pull something like this off.
Well, one person, maybe.
Which makes sense, since they both knew and worked for him and are clearly aware of what he's capable of. But for some reason, Demas just dismisses that idea out of hand, as though they're meant to believe Maul's long dead by now.
He's long gone.
Which I don't really get. Like, sure, maybe Maul got captured by the Republic on Mandalore, but I'm assuming once he escaped, he made contact with the various Syndicate leaders and tried to reestablish his power base, right? Like, if I meant to understand that Demas, Vario, and whatever crime bosses out there believed Maul is out of the picture because he got arrested, then that implies to me that Maul never reached out to any of them after getting away from the Republic, which would make it his own fault that they apparently abandoned him. How the fuck are they supposed to continue following you if they think you've been captured or killed? But the implication, based on Maul's own anger toward the Syndicate leaders, is that he did reach out to them, and that they all ignored or otherwise dismissed him, making him feel scorned and abandoned. But if that's the case, it should mean people like Demas and Vario were aware that he got away and was still alive and out there somewhere as of just a handful of months ago. A year tops. So it doesn't really make sense that either of them would just assume Maul's out of the picture, but the show needs them to think that for what's about to happen next. Demas continues to hurtle accusations towards Vario until one of his serving droids comes over with the platter, takes the top off, and reveals the severed head of the banking droid that Maul's men apparently managed to sneak in without either crew noticing. This sets Demas over the edge, and a firefight ensues. It's important to note, however, that Demas is given plenty of time to rationally consider the situation before making the decision to shoot. So I don't want to hear any of you try to argue that this was some heat-of-the-moment thing where he wasn't thinking clearly for the point I'm about to make, which is that this droid who brought the platter to the table was one of his own servants, so it just doesn't make sense to assume Vario somehow pulled this little stunt. And considering they both just discussed the possibility that there's an outside agent at play trying to pit them against each other, one who they know is capable of this sort of thing and should have no reason to assume he's not still around, surely that's what would make more sense here, right? Maul is banking on this guy being incredibly stupid in order for this to go the way he wants it to, but to me it seems like the more likely outcome here is him tipping his own hand and turning both syndicates against his extremely fragile band of criminals.
Not a great plan.
But sure, maybe Demas is just a characteristically stupid person, and Maul knew that from his time dealing with the guy, so this plan actually makes perfect sense. What doesn't make quite as much sense is how the rest of this little excursion plays out. Vario manages to get outside the warehouse, but Demas follows him out and shoots him in the back multiple times, causing him to fall over. It's then revealed to the audience that Vario is actually a little dude, and he uses the mech suit to make himself seem taller. This is something Demas is aware of, by the way.
You're looking grandiose as ever.
At least I fill the suit.
So, looks like we're maintaining consistency with the fact that he's incredibly stupid for not aiming for the head. You know, the only part of this body that's actually connected to Vario. It also doesn't even seem to do any meaningful damage to the suit, as Vario's able to slip right back into it and continue running. Since Maul's goal here was ultimately to kill both of them, he sends his men to pursue Demas via speeder chase through the city until eventually a bunch of bullshit happens that causes Vario to fall out of his vehicle, and he finds himself at the mercy of one of the Zabraks. The Night Brother has a gun trained on him for several seconds as Vario begins to recognize him, but doesn't complete the job, causing Vario to be rescued at the last minute by the cops, and Maul's team literally vanishes into thin air. And with that done, Vario is arrested by Lawson and brought to the police station for questioning, and now suddenly Maul is worried about being exposed.
Vario is in custody, and the local authorities will no doubt alert the Empire.
So that, coupled with his drive for revenge, causes Maul to decide to infiltrate the fucking police station and slaughter a bunch of cops just to get to Vario. And he's gonna have a pretty easy time of it, because Lawson didn't even bother to put him in any kind of protective center or anything more secure than a basic fucking holding cell in the station. It's not like this is a high-value gangster who just hinted that he's being targeted by a mysterious, powerful organization that Lawson would want to learn more about.
Ever heard of the Shadow Collective?
No. Should I have?
So whatever, man, just leave him in a cell with no extra supervision or anything, that's fine. Put him in the same block as a petty criminal you picked up earlier for stealing from a street vendor even. They're clearly on the same level in terms of value and immediate security risk. This character, by the way, is a mainstay on the show named Devin, who we're going to talk about more later, but I'm going to go ahead and say it now. Yes, it is extremely contrived that these two ended up on the same cell block together, considering all we just went over and what's about to happen. And while we're talking about plot contrivances, have I mentioned Maul's trusty little evil droid yet? He must have acquired this thing fairly recently, as we've never seen it before. He didn't have it anywhere in the Clone Wars, but by God, is it a little convenience machine. From the first scene, we see it pulling shit like this. I don't know how the fuck nobody saw that, but alright, man. And later, he's used to spy on Demas in his office and then listen into Demas and Vario's meet, which I have to believe powerful people like Demas have some sort of technological means to block some random droid from listening into all his dealings, right? Like, it just seems like that should not be a thing you can easily do in this world, and that there'd be measures in place to impede that. And it goes on like this throughout the entire show. Whenever Maul needs anything done that would be too difficult for him to believably pull off himself, this droid comes along and just does it for him. Later on, when the Empire shows up, it manages to sneak underneath one of the gunships and hack into its data recordings, giving Maul the latest Imperial intel on the thing he's currently trying to do, which we'll get to later. Again, somehow managing to do all this without even being seen, and with seemingly no explanation for how it's able to do this. Do the Empire really not have better security in place to prevent this sort of thing, or is the droid just that good? Where did he get this thing? How did he get his hands on an extremely capable droid after the events of the Clone Wars, when this show is trying to tell us that he's on the back foot and extremely limited in resources? I bring all this up so that you have the proper context for how exactly Maul is able to storm the police station and get to Vario. Basically, there are these seemingly abandoned access tunnels underneath the station that they're able to slip into without any trouble, that they somehow know about, and in those tunnels, there's a little panel that the droid is able to just hack into and gain control of the station's entire network. Somehow. It can then control its power system and open and close doors when and where needed to allow Maul and his team to move through, while impeding the cops trying to stop them. And of course, Maul continues using his lightsaber and does nothing at all to conceal his face, which perhaps wouldn't be such a big deal if he actually bothered to kill all witnesses, but he doesn't. He leaves Lawson alive for literally no other reason than that he's a main character. Maul gets to Vario and decides not to kill him, because it turns out Vario can be used to get Maul close to a different crime boss he wants to kill. I don't really care, it doesn't even really end up amounting to much, and frankly, considering how easy it ended up being for Maul to get to that guy, I don't really buy that he even needed Vario for it, but whatever. Vario isn't really even that important to the rest of the story. He just sort of hangs out and sometimes facilitates meetings between Maul and other characters who are actually important. But what actually matters about the outcome of this prison raid is that, again, yet another important character just so happens to be in the cell right across from Vario, and Maul senses her. To get into it, Devin is one of 2 Jedi we meet in the show who survived Order 66, because there aren't enough of those going around already, and very conveniently have ended up on the same planet as Maul at this particular point in time so that they can also be part of this story. Now, the show tries to do the whole Will of the Force thing that you all know I love, with Maul having apparently sensed some kind of connection to Devin since before even arriving on this planet. Now, he didn't come here specifically in search of her. Again, he's here to get his revenge on Vario and Demas, but they just so happen to have their little operations on the same planet where 2 surviving Jedi have chosen to seek refuge. I guess it's fate. We're instantly given characterization of both of these Jedi and the differences in how they view their situation by having Master Daki insist that they can get by as beggars, relying on the kindness of strangers to keep them fed, while Devin decides to take matters into her own hands and steal some food. She rationalizes this with the idea that the street vendor ultimately isn't going to be losing out on that much profit if she pockets some of his goods for herself, and I mean this unironically when I say that this is actually some pretty decent characterization that tells us a lot about this character by doing very little. Like, I'm not exactly impressed by any of this, but it's at least competent, even if short-lived. The competency of the writing is immediately undermined when she just so happens to bump into a cop droid, spill the food out from her hand, and then she just kind of stands there awkwardly waiting for the vendor to notice what just happened and alert the droid. There's no attempt to run as soon as the food hits the ground or anything, and even after they've clearly been made, neither of the Jedi make any attempt to flee. And this is because Daki has decided that it's best not to make a scene and advises her to just let herself get arrested, which, huh?
They will surely see to reason, and you'll soon be released.
What are you talking about?
Are you aware that you guys are Jedi in hiding? Very few people are more wanted than you, and unless you've equipped yourselves with some form of fake identification I don't know about, which is explicitly not the case.
We require your name and identification.
What difference does it make?
Attempted robbery, failure to cooperate, and no ID. Produce some identification. or spend a night in a cell.
I'm not exactly sure how you expect her to get out of this without a fight. This is our first introduction of these characters, and my impression of Master Daki is already that he's stupid. He's unwilling to fight, even to protect his Padawan from what might well turn into an Imperial Inquisition, and it's because of this that the only reason she gets out is because she just happened to be nearby when Maul showed up for Vario, which, only makes the situation worse for them because now they're in Maul's crosshairs and all that implies. This unwillingness to intervene isn't even consistently upheld, as he immediately gets involved in the subsequent police chase to rescue Devon. He even intervenes in a moment where innocent civilians are about to die by using the Force, exposing himself to an officer of the law. Again, we're relying heavily on the fact that this particular cop just so happens to want to avoid Imperial scrutiny, which these characters obviously couldn't have anticipated. It's also really lucky that Lawson was apparently the only one who noticed this. But I'm gonna rein us back in for a second, because as easy as it would be to continue as I have been, going over the plot and pointing out all the many issues therein, I already said I don't want this to be a typical review. And to that end, I'm trying to not get too bogged down in the details. It is true that I'm frustrated by this Jedi character's inconsistent motivations, and that gets exacerbated even further in a later episode when, after Devon has already been safely returned to him, he decides it's a good idea for the two of them to try to apprehend Maul rather than keep their heads down and try to find a way off planet. The cops have more than sufficient resources to apprehend Maul, or at least that should be the case, so if we're keeping consistent with Daki's previous characterization, he should want to let the authorities deal with the situation. I could go on all day about this sort of thing, I really could, but for the moment I'm now going to return to the question, what do you want from Star Wars? Have you given it any more thought? Pretty much none of the characters' actions have made any sense or been in line with previous characterization, meaning the plot is being pushed forward at every angle by cheap, lazy, and contrived writing. Resources come and go arbitrarily depending on when the script requires our characters to be at an advantage or to lack one, and after just broadly covering the first few episodes of the show, we've already uncovered all the ways in which nothing is obeying basic cause and effect. So, what exactly is this all for? Well, to be cynical for a moment, I know exactly what it's for. It's absolutely no surprise to me that Maul can say in one scene that he wants to keep to the shadows and stay off the Empire's radar, and then in the next whip out his lightsaber and start cutting up nameless goons and police droids. It's no surprise to me when the supposedly wise Jedi Master, whose first bit of characterization we're given is that he wants to avoid causing a ruckus lest it draw the Empire right to them, will immediately turn around and decide it's a good idea to go after Darth fucking Maul while the threat of the Empire cracking down on this planet actively looms over them. It goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning, about how Maul is, from his inception, the very embodiment of hype moments and aura, and that's really all this show cares to monopolize on. Not the character underneath the cool, the thing that actually made him compelling in the Clone Wars and Rebels. What matters is that he swings around his double-bladed lightsaber while Duel of the Fates plays over top a sequence of mindless, weightless action, just like it did the first time, right? It personally annoys me that they use that song at all in this situation, considering Duel of the Fates was never Darth Maul's theme, and was always intended as exactly what the name of the piece implies, an operatic lament of the fate of the galaxy, of Anakin Skywalker. It plays in the final fight of the Phantom Menace because the outcome of that duel will decide the trajectory of Anakin's life, and that's why it's continually used for Anakin in the following films. It plays when he searches for his mother on Tatooine, because obviously Shmi's death and the subsequent Tusken Massacre are about to heavily pivot the direction of his life going forward, and it's mixed into Battle of the Heroes because that entire fight is the culmination of Anakin's final descent into Vader. So I say again, the song doesn't belong to Maul, and the only reason it's being used here is to harken back to the thing we all watched when we were kids 27 fucking years ago. But people got mad at me when I made this argument on Twitter, so let me move on to a different point. Every episode in this show has some kind of lightsaber action. As soon as the Inquisitors show up, I'm pretty sure there's at least one lightsaber fight in every episode, and there are even a couple before that thanks to Daki breaking character to go after Maul. So I gotta ask, is this what you want from Star Wars? Is this all it takes to leave you satisfied and wanting more? Now I gotta say this just because I know the straw man argument that's coming my way. Wah, the pretentious Andor fan is mad that there are lightsabers in a Star Wars show. I love lightsabers. I think they're cool as hell, and I probably wouldn't be as big a fan of the franchise as I am today were I not absolutely enamored by them every every time they popped up on my screen as a kid. But when they're used arbitrarily or weightlessly, the wonder and excitement they elicit kind of start to lose their impact. And when every single episode has a lightsaber fight where nothing substantive happens other than mindless action taking up 5 to 10 minutes of screen time, to put it conservatively, it's hard to keep my eyes from glazing over and just waiting for it to finish, which is exactly what my last girlfriend said to me. And skipping ahead a bit, basically the entire final episode of the show is just one big lightsaber duel. Vader finally shows up to start kicking ass, and he and his 2 lackeys chase Maul and his companions through various parts of the jungle, and it's just nothing. I mean, first of all, the power scaling for Maul has been pretty bad for a while, with the Clone Wars never quite being consistent with how powerful and skilled Maul actually is, and it kind of gets to a point where this supposedly powerful Sith Lord, one who managed to overpower a Jedi Master at like 22 years old, is suddenly losing to a 17-year-old Padawan who hasn't kept up with her training in like 6 months. But I've always maintained that just because bad writing exists elsewhere, that doesn't give you an excuse to carry it forward, and it especially doesn't give you an excuse to make it worse. The 2 Inquisitors who get dispatched in the show to hunt Maul are ones we've seen before. Incidentally, they've each gone up against Ahsoka, and neither of them lasted very long, to say the least. So I know the Clone Wars tried to pretend that it makes sense that Maul lost to Ahsoka, but even then we're shown that it was a relatively close fight, and he had her on the back foot for most of it, meaning if she can make quick work of these guys, Maul should be able to as well. Even the watered-down version of him from the Clone Wars, and even in a 2-on-1. But when he actually does face off against either one of them individually, they're an extremely difficult match, and with the 2 of them put together, he gets the shit kicked out of him. The show tries to pretend it's because his robotic leg is injured, but said injury really doesn't hinder him that much unless the script requires it to, and is otherwise completely forgotten about. And even with that, I don't believe Maul should be losing to these lackeys. But the fact that he does, and does as thoroughly as we see here, means that the second Vader enters the fight, he should be dead within seconds. I mean, even the real Darth Maul who took down Qui-Gon isn't lasting more than like a few minutes with the guy, realistically. In fact, I'm pretty sure I remember reading somewhere that Maul was originally supposed to fight Vader in Twilight of the Apprentice, and that would result in his death, but they ultimately scrapped that idea in favor of keeping him alive for season 3. So it seems like, at least back then, there was at least some recognition of the fact that if Maul and Vader were ever to fight, Maul wouldn't make it out of that alive. So when I watch Maul and random Order 66 survivor number 74 face off against the most powerful Sith Lord to ever live, and live for longer than a minute, with 2 other Inquisitors backing Vader up for good measure, I immediately understand that the power scaling is once again being thrown out for the sake of prolonging this fight. The show is trying to elevate the tension, but is doing so at the expense of the stakes, which is, well, pretty contradictory, I would say. The longer this fight goes on, the more obvious it gets, and I kid you not, in the finale, there's like a good 7-minute chunk where they're fighting Vader on the bridge, and then it'll cut to different characters doing different shit, and then cut back to the lightsaber fight, then back to the characters, back to the fight, over and over and over again, with no actual progression happening in the fight. They're locked in a stalemate to fill the runtime until the writers finally decide it's time to move the plot forward. But second, one of the main reasons why this fight lacks any substance is because Vader doesn't talk at all. And I get what they're going for. They're trying to make Vader this big, scary beast of a man who basically bulldozes his way through Maul and the Jedi with seeming ease, which, again, is undermined significantly the longer these characters are locked in a stalemate. But I also wonder if there might have been a motivation to keep Vader from speaking because James Earl Jones passed away a couple years back, and Disney have been scared of recasting for a while now, so maybe they felt like trying to replace him with a new voice actor would have received backlash. I mean, Vader has been voiced by other people before.
I lied.
But never in any official show or film since the Disney buyout. And I guess I prefer this to the shitty AI re-speecher shit they used in Kenobi.
I am not interested in civilities. Have you come to destroy me, Obi-Wan?
But I just don't think that a silent Vader worked as a creative choice, because when it comes right down to it, these two characters should have a laundry list of things to say to each other. They both have an obsession with finding and killing Kenobi, they both have a connection to Ahsoka, which, by the way, this show takes place before the Siege of Mandalore epilogue, because the Stormtroopers still have their shitty transitional TK armor from the Bad Batch, rather than the more standard ones we're used to, which means Vader still has yet to find the remains of the Star Destroyer and conclude that Ahsoka must be dead. He should still be pretty actively searching for any leads as to her whereabouts, and Maul was one of the last people Vader knows was with her at the time of Order 66. And most importantly, both are or were apprentices of Darth Sidious who will inevitably be cast aside once they've outlived their usefulness, which is something you'd think Maul would try to point out to him in light of what happened to Dooku. It's a point of comparison he makes with Ahsoka, and even an idea the show briefly plays around with when he's trying to get through to Devin now that all the Jedi have effectively been discarded by the powers that be, though they don't really do anything interesting with that. There are a million different parallels that exist between these two characters, and while I don't necessarily agree with the idea of having them meet, if you're gonna do that anyway, you could at least touch on some of them. You could even maybe mention the fact that Maul had visions of Anakin being groomed to become Palpatine's new apprentice, and that's what spurred on all the events of Siege of Mandalore. Anything at all. This all leads to the whole encounter having an intrinsic weightlessness to it. Lightsaber duels in the original films were used sparingly, and when they did happen, they served a purpose. They pushed the narrative forward, they developed the characters, they had consequences. What are the consequences of this fight? Jedi Master Daki died and Devin is really mad about it? That's fucking nothing. She's barely a character. I have nothing to latch onto here. What about Maul or Vader or anyone else involved in this fucking story? Now, one thing I will say is that I've already seen the criticism thrown around that Vader shouldn't be here and that he's just being shoehorned in for fan service reasons. And I don't strictly agree with that, but there are some major caveats to me saying that. My issue, if anything, is that Vader waited too long to join the party, considering the Empire showed up on this planet like halfway through the season. I already went over one of the many reasons Vader would have a personal investment in finding Maul, but there are several others. He and Sidious would consider him a powerful threat that needs to be dealt with, so Maul would be one of the highest priority targets post-66, right underneath Yoda and maybe Obi-Wan. He might even want to capture Maul alive just in case the guy has any intel on Kenobi's whereabouts, considering his own vendetta against Obi-Wan that Vader is fully aware of. Or maybe there's still some part of him that wants revenge for Qui-Gon, someone Anakin looked up to like almost a father. There's all sorts of different reasons, so the real issue is that he even bothered to dispatch Inquisitors to do the job at all, instead of just going after himself from the get-go. But on a meta level, I do agree with that initial criticism, because it ties back to the main point I've been making about this show to begin with. There's no reason to tell a story about this era of Maul's life, and there's no reason he should be moving so carelessly as to attract Imperial attention, which means there should be no reason Vader ever gets involved, but how can we have hype moments in Aura without Darth Vader? Wouldn't it be so cool if Vader showed up and fought Darth Maul? Wouldn't it be so cool if he didn't say a word because he's just that mean and scary? You can argue, as I just did, that it technically makes sense that Vader is here, as long as you ignore all the ways in which it still really doesn't. But I think you're missing the forest for the trees if you do that, because what's actually being argued is that the writers should never have put these characters in that position in the first place. There's more to writing a story and trying to slot it into the larger canon of an ongoing franchise than just making sure it technically makes sense. And that's an issue I keep bumping into when it comes to discussing Disney Star Wars with its defenders. Tell me one thing that this show is trying to accomplish thematically, which I guess brings me nicely to the final thing I want to talk about with this show. There's a million more things I could discuss about how broken the writing is, but I want you guys to know that I'm showing severe restraint here. No, the last thing that I find even remotely worth exploring here is how the show chooses to characterize Darth Maul, because it's pretty bad, but in a kind of interesting way. Now, we've already gone over a lot of the ways in which he makes stupid decisions that are actively contradictory to his stated motivations, but I want to go a bit deeper than that, starting with Episode 8. This episode is what I can only generously refer to as a character study for Maul, after the 7 previous episodes do basically nothing with him other than vaguely gesture at more interesting ideas. Up to this point, it was mainly coasting off of the previous characterization he's received from the other shows, which, as I've already said, is quite good, but not enough to sustain us here. But in Episode 8, Maul finds himself isolated and vulnerable after his unbelievably stupid loss at the hands of the Inquisitors, and an escape that I can't even describe with words. Like, you just need to see it for yourself, and I need you to trust me when I promise that I did not edit this sound effect in. And it's in this state of isolation that Maul begins having visions of some of the more traumatic moments that define his past. The first of which is of the day Sidious took him away from Dathomir, and we see a young Savage imploring him not to go, and screaming at Sidious for taking him away. And this scene made me raise an eyebrow for a number of reasons, but first and foremost, the Clone Wars strongly implied that Maul and Savage didn't know each other as children, and they definitely weren't close, like this scene is implying. Savage didn't even know he had any other brothers aside from Farrell.
You have a brother.
A brother? But all of my kin were killed.
You could argue that he just assumed Maul was dead, but I'm not sure why he would believe that unless he somehow knew what became of him on Naboo, which we know that he doesn't at this point.
He took them from me! He took them!
Who took them?
Jedi! Jedi!
So if Savage knew that he had another brother who was taken away by some mysterious figure when they were children, then when Talzin brings up that he has other family out there, you'd think his mind would immediately go to the one that he remembers from childhood, right? Even if he assumed Maul was dead for whatever reason, you'd think he'd mention that during this scene. And for Maul's part, there seems to be at least some recognition of Savage when he first comes to after Talzin restores his sanity.
Brother.
Which, to be honest, could just be because Savage has repeatedly referred to Maul as his brother, and Maul might just remember that.
Yes, we are brothers!
But even if not, Maul recognizing Savage, but Savage having not known about Maul before being told of him would imply that Savage was a baby when Maul left, not that they were seemingly the same age. This scene is really cringe, and I kinda don't believe Sidious isn't just killing Savage for talking shit, but whatever. At the risk of being a broken record, there's a pretty obvious reason why Savage was shoehorned in here, and it's not to do with anything even remotely artistically meaningful. The one thing about all this that I actually do think is pretty decent is how all these traumatic flashbacks culminate in the ultimate truth that Maul is still that same scared little boy Sidious stole away from his home all those years ago. A broken kid desperate for approval and infinitely resentful toward the one who would always deny him that connection, the one who always kept him at arm's length, and the one who ultimately cast him aside. Maul is a lonely child filled with deep-seated abandonment issues, and there is something kind of beautiful in its own way about Maul looking at that lost, scared little boy and forgiving him. But it doesn't exactly fit with his overall story, does it? At the end of the day, this whole idea of Maul being stuck in a perpetual state of self-loathing and abandonment is the point of his character. He's meant to be someone who fundamentally can't see past his own blind rage. He'll never grow beyond this point, and we're shown that he never does. That even up to just a few years before A New Hope, 3 decades after his initial defeat by Obi-Wan, he's still emotionally in that same place as he was then, still bent on revenge and with no greater goal to aspire to. This scene is great for a number of reasons, and I will eventually cover it in more detail when I finally do a Rebels deep dive in like 10 years, but its best quality is that it really highlights the tragedy of Maul's character. He lost so easily to Obi-Wan because, unlike Maul, Obi-Wan actually grew. He learned from his mistakes, and the mistakes of Qui-Gon, and it's why this fight was simply never a contest. So while I appreciate that this show is at least maintaining consistency with that idea, you can't exactly have Maul be aware of the fact because that changes the story too much. It gives him the clarity to move forward, and he was never supposed to have that, which in many ways turns this one single moment into a microcosm of the larger issue I've been hammering home here. By adding this into the story, by filling in this gap unnecessarily, you've now provided too much detail. There's too much definition to Maul's story. Less was always more with this character, and now his overuse has actively damaged the central through line of his arc in a way that's very strange. But what's even more strange is what he chooses to do with this self-revelation.
I won't let him do this to anyone else.
I beg your pardon, sir, but do you know what he's talking about?
And this brings me to the second major issue with the way they've chosen to characterize Maul here. He's too noble? I was initially assuming I'd misread the intent of this line because Maul is, and has always been, an incredibly selfish character. A lot of that stems from the abandonment issues we went over a bit ago. Having had to scrape and claw for every single thing he has in his life, he's had to form a very me philosophy. He doesn't do anything without it benefiting him in some way, and that even extends to what might even be seen as his more favorable attributes. Things like valuing connection, kinship. Those are only to fill his own sense of loneliness and lust for power. Like, I think it's pretty clear that he loves Savage, but he still ultimately views their relationship in a dominating way. He's the master, Savage is the apprentice, and if Savage doesn't agree with that, he's more than happy to put him in his place. There have been a few different instances where Maul has sought kinship with others as a means of replicating what he had with Savage, but that's for better and for worse. So he extends a hand to Ahsoka and genuinely wants her to be his ally, but it has to be on his terms, and when she doesn't agree to them, he tries to kill her. Same thing with Ezra. He seems to want a real connection with him, but the second Ezra doesn't give him exactly what he wants, he flips out. Because that kinship he seeks is only in service to making himself feel better. I say all this to say, any instance where Maul does anything that could be even remotely construed as selfless is really just him serving himself in a roundabout way. One we or the characters may not initially see, but it is there. So, like with this new character Devin, we're being shown something similar to these other two cases I just mentioned, where he does genuinely feel a connection with this person and wants to cultivate into a sort of sibling dynamic, but it's different here. There are far too many moments where he actually goes out of his way to help her in ways that endanger his own safety and ability to get what he wants. So in the middle part of the season, he delays his own escape from the Empire in order to go help her when she's being chased by Inquisitors. Or there are several moments in just the final 2 episodes where Maul puts himself in a vulnerable position so that she and the others can get away safely. This man has just had it made very clear to him that he's no match for both Inquisitors by himself, let alone them plus a bunch of stormtroopers, yet he volunteered to hold the line so that the rest of the characters could make it to safety?
Cross! My lord, no! Now!
I do not believe this is in character for him to do, and if you want to argue that he's only pretending to be heroic in order to make Devin think there's more to him than just some evil monster, I need only point to the other 2 examples that I just laid out to determine how far Maul is willing to go to impress his prospective apprentices. When it came to Ahsoka, he had an extraction plan ready to go, so he didn't feel like he was in any danger of being captured by Republic forces, and if Ahsoka chose to join him, they would have just left that way together. Since she refused him, Maul immediately pivoted to trying to kill her, and then once he realized she was more of a match than he initially calculated, he just tried to flee. But Ezra actually gives us a much better insight here, because there is never any point where Maul puts himself at risk of dealing with forces beyond his control in order to turn him to his side. The second Vader shows up on Malachor, he turns tail and runs. Both of these examples make it pretty clear that whatever care Maul may or may not have for someone he considers a potential companion begins and ends with how they can serve him, and he isn't willing to sacrifice anything for them. So it doesn't make sense for him to suddenly put on this act of nobility for Devin while actively endangering himself in the process, meaning the only conclusion I can really come to here is that it's actually genuine, and that I did interpret that line correctly in episode 8. It seems like he actually cares about the pain Sidious has caused and will continue to cause, and wants to stop him for the sake of preventing that from happening to anyone else. It's not a revenge thing, it's genuine heroism. At least that's how the line frames it. Honestly, the only time Maul does anything in this final episode that can be considered selfish is when he betrays Daki at the end, which itself is kind of a weird, pointless moment. Like, I'm not really sure why he decided to slightly inconvenience Daki by pushing him forward with the Force somewhat, because it didn't really seem to be all that much of a hindrance, and I don't know why he would want it to be when, theoretically, he wants Daki to last as long as he possibly can in order to give himself and Devin more time to escape. So it would make more sense to do nothing to him. Just leave him to his fate, knowing full well he's gonna die. But I guess the showrunners couldn't trust us to understand that's what he was doing and thought maybe we'd assume he was just going to help Devin since he's such a great guy. So they had to visually depict the idea that this was indeed a betrayal, and this was all they could come up with. In either case, if this moment was meant to be indicative of Maul not being quite as noble as his previous actions would have us believe, then sorry. You're gonna need to give me a better reason for why he put his life on the line in those moments than the ones we've just gone over. And until then, I'm forced to walk away with a very confused and contradictory understanding of who this character even is. But I can tell you one thing, he sure as hell isn't the Darth Maul we've seen everywhere else in the story. So Daki's death is the final catalyst that pushes Devin over to the dark side, because that's been her arc this whole time. Maul's been pulling his enlightened centrist shtick out every time they have a chance to talk about why things suck, and she's had probably the most straightforward and predictable journey one could have for the type of character they're going for. before. It's actually kind of impressive just how baseline and generic they were able to make this. It's like they found a template online called How to Make a Disillusioned Jedi Fall to the Dark Side and just followed it to the letter. There is nothing interesting to say about her, and at the end of the show, she tells Maul that she's finally ready to become his apprentice and take the fight to the Sith. And hey, I'm sure in, say it with me now, Season 2, they might even do something compelling with that. We'll just have to wait and see. Maul Shadow Lord is a generic, cookie-cutter addition to this story with all the same shitty writing qualities to be found in any other Disney Star Wars show. The only difference is that it has Darth Maul in it, and he does cool flips and spins. There's nothing here even approaching dramatic weight, and after the 7th or 8th lightsaber duel, you might even find yourself realizing you can no longer feel your heartbeat, and maybe you should go talk to someone about that. The show is messy, rushed, contrived, and absolutely devoid of thematic value. But hey, if that's what you want from Star Wars,